What in the world does a revolution have to do with tea? And how could a crop like cotton, King Cotton, fail to win a whole war? Well, the answer to both questions is actually the same. It's one of the most powerful forces in all of economics, the monopoly. And today we're going to unpack exactly how total market control has shaped and continues to shape our world. Okay, so let's rewind the clock all the way back to 1773. The British Parliament basically hands the East India Company the exclusive right to sell tea in the American colonies. And you know how the colonists reacted, right? Yep, they tossed it right into the harbor. But here's the thing. Was that explosive moment really just about the price of a cup of tea? All right, now let's jump forward a bit to 1860. The southern states, they were producing almost all the cotton that Great Britain's massive textile mills needed. They were so sure they had this incredible economic weapon, they thought, hey, this will totally force Britain to side with us in the Civil War. So what went wrong? Why didn't it work? To figure out these historical puzzles, we really have to get to grips with the economic powerhouse at the center of it all, the monopoly. So let's just dive right in and break down what a monopoly actually is and, where all its power comes from. Think about it like this. If you were an Olympic athlete, what would you prefer? To be so much better than everyone else that it's not even a contest? Or to be in a nail-biter of a race with a dozen other people who are just as good as you are? Yeah, most businesses would pick option one. They want to be that unchallenged champion. And that's exactly what a monopoly is. It's a market with zero competition. It is the complete opposite of what we'd call a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so this brings up a pretty big question, right? If being a monopoly is so awesome and profitable, why doesn't every other company just jump in and start competing? Well, the answer is monopolists are experts at building these incredible economic fortresses to keep everyone else out. And the walls of that fortress? In economics, we call them barriers to entry. And they're exactly what they sound like. They are these legal or technological or just plain market forces that make it super hard, or even impossible, for a new competitor to even get a foot in the door. So how do you actually build these fortress walls? Well, turns out there are a bunch of different ways. A company might control a really important resource, or maybe they get some help from the law. Let's dig into a few of the most common strategies. First up, you've got what's called a natural monopoly. This is when it costs an absolute fortune to get started, but adding one more customer costs next to nothing. Just think about it, right? It would be crazy expensive and super wasteful to have two different water companies running two different sets of pipes to your house. It just makes way more sense for one company to handle the whole neighborhood. Then you have barriers that are actually created by the government. A patent is a fantastic example of this. So to get companies to spend millions and millions on research for, say, a new life-saving drug, the government gives them a temporary monopoly. For 20 years here in the US, they are the only ones who can sell it. It's basically a reward for all that innovation, giving them a chance to make back all that R&D money. And here, this kind of brings it all together. You can really see the different flavors, can't you? You've got things like De Beers controlling the diamond supply, which happened without any help from the government. Then you have things like the US Postal Service, which is a legal monopoly, created by law. And then you've got the really aggressive stuff, like predatory pricing, which is just a brutal way to scare off anyone who even thinks about competing. Okay, so now we get how monopolies build their fortresses. The next logical question is, what do they do with all that power? How do they actually decide what to charge for their stuff? This is where you see the huge difference in power. A normal company, one with a lot of competition, is what we call a price taker. They just have to accept whatever the market price is. But a monopolist? Oh no, they're a price maker. They're the ones calling the shots on price. But, that power isn't unlimited. A monopolist can't just decide to charge $1 billion for a pencil, right? Because if the price is way too high, nobody's going to buy it. But if it's too low, they're leaving a ton of cash on the table. So the real challenge, the whole game, isn't just about making the most money in sales. It's about finding that perfect sweet spot that gives them the biggest possible profit. So how do they find that magic number? Well, it's this really calculated three-step dance. Step one, they figure out the perfect quantity to produce. They make items right up to the point where making just one more would actually cost them more than they'd earn from it. Step two, they look at that quantity and ask, what is the absolute highest price anyone is willing to pay for this? And step three, if that price is higher than what it costs them on average to make the thing, boom, That difference is pure, uncut monopoly profit. All right, we've got our economic toolkit ready. We now understand barriers to entry. We know how monopolists think about pricing. So I think it's time we go back to the beginning and finally solve those historical mysteries. So, back to that first question. Could a tea company really start a revolution? Well, not exactly. See, the East India Company's monopoly wasn't airtight. The colonists could and did get cheaper, smuggled tea from the Dutch. The real powder keg here was political. The Tea Act was just the last straw in this huge fight over no taxation without representation. It was about politics, not just pennies. And what about King Cotton? Why did that plan fall apart? Well, it turns out there were three huge reasons. First, Britain was already sitting on massive stockpiles of cotton. They were good for almost 2 years. Second, once Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, there was just no way that anti-slavery Britain could politically justify supporting the Confederacy. And third, Britain just went and found new suppliers in places like India, Egypt, and Brazil. The monopoly just wasn't the slam dunk the South thought it was. Look, these aren't just cool stories from a history book. They teach us this really critical lesson about both the power and the limits of a monopoly. And these lessons are still playing out all around us, right now. There's this fantastic quote from the Nobel-winning economist John Hex. He said, "The best of all monopoly profits is a quiet life." And what he meant by that is without any competition nipping at their heels, monopolies can just get lazy. They don't have to innovate. They don't have to improve their service. They don't have to lower prices. They just get to cruise along living a quiet life while we, the consumers, pay the price. And we saw a perfect real-world example of this with AT&T. For decades, they had a total monopoly on phone service. There was that old joke, you could get your phone in any color you wanted, as long as it was black. But then it got broken up in 1982. And what happened? A complete explosion of innovation. Suddenly you had new companies fighting for your business, which gave us things like caller ID and eventually mobile phones, all with way lower prices. That, right there, is the power of competition. And please, don't make the mistake of thinking this is all ancient history. I mean, as recently as 2013, the Windows operating system was on more than 90% of personal computers. That's a near monopoly right there. And for years now, the US Department of Justice has been going after some of the biggest tech giants, basically arguing that they're using their power in one market to crush competition in another. So that brings us to the last question. And this one's for you. Now that you know what to look for, right? The high walls to get in, the lack of real choices, maybe a product that never seems to get any better, where do you see a monopoly hiding in plain sight in your own life? I mean, think about it. Your internet provider, the social media apps you use, the software on your computer. The power of monopoly is everywhere once you know what you're looking for.